Disclaimer: these stories are inspired by tales originally shared on Reddit, reimagined for entertainment purposes. Any similarities to real events, people, or places are purely coincidental. The voices in the static. When I was 16, I got a cheap second-hand TV for my room. It wasn't anything fancy, but I loved it because I could watch shows late at night without bothering my family. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of static. I must have fallen asleep with the TV on, but what was weird was that the TV wasn't tuned to any channel. It was just a screen of white noise. As I reached for the remote, I heard it, a faint voice coming from the static. At first, I thought it was a late-night broadcast cutting through, but then I heard it more clearly. It was saying my name. I froze. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Come closer," it said. "We need to see you." I grabbed the remote and tried to turn the TV off, but it wouldn't respond. The static grew louder and more voices joined in, all speaking over one another in a cacophony of whispers. I finally yanked the plug out of the wall and the TV went dark. The next morning I told my mom, but she just laughed it off, saying I must have been dreaming. I threw the TV out that same day. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint static coming from the walls of my room. The room that didn't exist. When I was 12, my family moved into an old house with a strange layout. There was a narrow hallway at the back of the house with a locked door at the end. My parents told me it was just an unused storage room, but they didn't have a key. Being a curious kid, I tried everything to open it. Paper clips, bobby pins, even a credit card, but the door wouldn't budge. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of faint knocking. It was coming from the direction of the hallway. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the sound. When I reached the locked door, the knocking stopped. I put my ear to the wood and held my breath. That's when I heard it, a faint voice whispering my name from the other side. The next morning, I told my parents, but they brushed it off as a nightmare. A few days later, though, my dad decided to break the lock and see what was inside. When the door swung open, we were shocked. The room wasn't empty. It was filled with old furniture, dusty books, and faded photographs. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But what chilled me the most was a mirror on the far wall. Written in the dust in perfect, clean handwriting was my name. The bus stop stranger. I was waiting for the bus one evening after work, standing alone at a deserted stop. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavy and everything seemed too quiet. I had my headphones in, scrolling through my phone, when I felt some stop stranger. I was waiting for the bus one evening after work, standing alone at a deserted stop. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavy and everything seemed too quiet. I had my headphones in, scrolling through my phone, when I felt someone standing behind me. I turned around and saw a man in a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He was staring at me, but his face was hard to make out. It was like it was slightly out of focus. "Nice night, isn't it?" he said. His voice was calm but strange, like it was coming from far away. I nodded, uneasy, and turned back to face the road. But when I glanced at the glass of the bus shelter, I saw his reflection. He wasn't standing still anymore. He was moving closer, but without actually taking steps. It was like he was gliding. I spun around, ready to confront him, but he was gone. The bus pulled up a few seconds later, and I hurried on, looking back at the stop as the doors closed. The man was standing there again, staring at me as the bus drove away. I never saw him again. But now, whenever I wait at a bus stop alone, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. The photo frame. I've always loved thrifting. There's something exciting about finding old, unique items and imagining the stories behind them. A few months ago, during one of my weekend flea market trips, I stumbled across this beautiful vintage photo frame. It was ornate, heavy, and covered in delicate carvings of flowers and vines. The seller told me it had been part of an estate sale, and I bought it for just $5. When I got home, I cleaned it up and put a picture of my family inside, one from our last vacation together. I set it on my nightstand, proud of how it looked. That night, as I crawled into bed, I glanced at it one last time before turning off the lights. Everything seemed fine. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, But as I blinked in the darkness, I realized it was coming from inside the room. My heart raced as I sat up and switched on the bedside lamp. That's when I noticed the photo frame. It was turned, facing me. I was sure I had left it facing the wall. Telling myself I must have bumped it before bed, I turned it back around and tried to go back to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened. I woke up to the same tapping sound, and once again the frame was facing me. This time I felt uneasy. I hadn't touched it all day. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the vibrations from closing the bedroom door had shifted it. I turned it back again and went to sleep. But the same thing happened the following night, and the night after that. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore the unsettling pattern. I decided to examine the frame more closely, holding it under the light. As I tilted it, something about the glass caught my attention. The reflection wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just smudges or scratches, but as I looked closer, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In the reflection of the photo's glass, there was a faint outline of a face, just behind my family. It was blurry, almost like a shadow, but it was definitely there. My stomach dropped. I pulled the photo out of the frame and checked it carefully. There was nothing in the background of the original picture. No extra faces, no shadows, nothing. Shaking, I put the frame down and left the room, but convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But that night, I woke up to more than tapping. I felt a cold breeze, like someone had opened a window. But all the windows were shut. My eyes adjusted to the dark and I froze. The frame wasn't just turned toward me this time, it was right next to me on the bed. The face in the reflection was clearer now. Pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, staring right at me. I grabbed the frame and threw it into the closet, slamming the door shut. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I drove back to the flea market, desperate to return it. But when I got to the stall where I'd bought it, the seller wasn't there. In fact, no one remembered the stall being there at all. I ended up leaving the frame in a donation box at a nearby thrift store, hoping that would be the end of it. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint tapping. And in my dreams, I see that same face, grinning, watching, waiting. The Vanishing Boy. When I was about 10 years old, my friends and I loved playing hide and seek in the woods near my house. The area was huge, with trees so thick that it felt like a maze. One summer afternoon, we were playing our usual game when I spotted a boy I didn't recognize. He was standing near the creek, wearing old clothes that looked like they were from another time. Suspenders, a white shirt, and scuffed boots. He smiled at me and waved before running deeper into the woods. Thinking he was a new kid from the neighborhood, I chased after him, calling out, "Hey, wait up!" But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't catch up. He was always just out of reach. Eventually, I stopped, out of breath, and realized I was alone. The woods were completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. I felt a chill and decided to head back to the group. When I told my friends about the boy, they gave me confused looks. None of them had seen anyone else in the woods. That night, I told my mom about it, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, her face went pale. "That sounds like Tommy," she said softly. When I asked who that was, she explained that Tommy was a boy who had drowned in the creek years before I was born. She even showed me an old photo of him, and it was the same boy I'd seen. I never went back to those woods. Sometimes, though, when I drive past them, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A boy standing near the creek, smiling, before disappearing into the trees. Nurse's eerie encounter. Been a nurse for nearly a decade, working in a long-term care facility that sees its fair share of heartbreak. Over the years, I've gotten used to the quiet hum of the night shift, the stillness of sleeping halls, the occasional sound of a call bell ringing. But one night still lingers in my mind, a night that left me questioning what's real and what isn't. It was just after 3 a.m. when the call bell for room 207 rang. That was Mr. Thornton's room. He was a sweet man, always polite, though he kept to himself most of the time. At 87, his health was declining, but he wasn't someone who rang his bell often, especially not in the middle of the night. When I entered the room, he was sitting up in bed, gripping his blanket tightly. His face was pale, and his eyes darted toward the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. "Nurse, please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Get him out of there." "Get who out of where?" I asked, stepping closer. "The man," he said, pointing to the bathroom, "the one with no face. He's in there, watching me." A chill ran down my spine. I turned to the bathroom, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty. I flicked on the light and checked behind the door. Nothing. The small bathroom was completely empty. "There's no one here, Mr. Thornton," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You must have had a bad dream." He shook his head, his eyes never leaving the bathroom. "He's still here," he whispered, "even if you can't see him." I tried to reassure him as best I could and stayed with him until he seemed calmer. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. About 10 minutes later, the call bell for room 214 rang. That was on the opposite end of the hall, far from Mr. Thornton's room. The patient, Mrs. Evans, was sitting up in bed when I arrived, her hands trembling as she pointed toward her bathroom door. "He was in there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the man without a face." My heart skipped a beat. "What did he look like?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She shook her head. "No face, just darkness where it should have been. He was standing there, watching me." I checked her bathroom too, switching on the light and looking everywhere, but again, nothing. Still, the air in the room felt heavy, like the weight of an unseen presence. I reassured her the best I could, but I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. 2 patients, both describing the same thing, within minutes of each other? It didn't make sense. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder as I walked the halls. The flickering hallway lights and shifting shadows only made things worse. I couldn't wait for the morning shift to arrive. When they did, I gave my report and mentioned Mr. Thornton's anxiety during the night. It wasn't until later, as I was getting ready to leave, that one of the morning nurses came to me. Her face pale. "Did you hear about Mr. Thornton?" she asked. My stomach dropped. "What about him?" "He passed away early this morning, around 6 a.m. The night aide found him." Her voice trembled. It was sudden. He wasn't expected to go yet. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The memory of his terrified expression flashed in my mind. Did he say anything before he passed?" I asked. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. "He told the aide, 'Don't let him take me.' I didn't say anything else. I just left, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. 2 patients, both seeing the same faceless figure. Mr. Thornton, dead just hours later. And Mrs. Evans, who still refused to sleep in her room for weeks afterward. I don't know what I saw or didn't see that night, but I know it wasn't just a coincidence. When I moved into my first house, I was excited to finally have my own space. It was an older place, but it had charm. Wooden floors, big windows, and a small attic for storage. The attic gave me the creeps, though. It was dusty, cramped, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling barely lit up the room. About a month after I moved in, I started hearing humming late at night. It was soft at first, just a faint melody that seemed to drift through the house. I thought it might be coming from a neighbor's house or even the pipes, but it was always clearest when I was lying in bed. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed up into the attic. The humming stopped the moment I opened the door. The attic was empty, except for an old wooden trunk I hadn't noticed before. It was covered in dust, and the lock was rusted shut. I thought about leaving it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I managed to pry the lid open, and inside was a small, broken music box. The mechanism was rusted, and the key missing. As soon as I touched it, the humming started again, and this time louder and coming from right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I dropped the box and ran downstairs. I got rid of the music box the next day, but the humming didn't stop. Even now, I hear it sometimes. It's softer now, fainter, but always in the same tune. and I can't help but feel like whatever it is, it's still in the attic, waiting for me to come back. It was one of those nights where sleep just wouldn't come. The clock read 2:17 a.m., and the silence in my apartment felt suffocating. I decided a walk might clear my head. The streets were deserted, the kind of quiet that makes every sound echo just a little too loudly. The occasional streetlight flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows on the pavement. As I turned onto a familiar stretch of road, I noticed him. At first, he seemed harmless. A man standing under a street lamp, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that seemed a little out of place. His hands were in his pockets and he was staring down the road. But something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he was standing, too still, like a mannequin in a storefront window. Or maybe it was his face. He was smiling. Not a friendly, passing smile, but a wide, strained grin, as though his face was stuck that way. The sight made my stomach churn, but I told myself it was nothing. Just a weirdo out late, like me. I crossed the street to avoid him. As I passed, I could feel his eyes on me. I told myself not to look, but my curiosity got the better of me. I glanced back, and my blood ran cold. He had turned to face me, still standing under the street lamp, his grin even wider now. His head tilted slightly, like he was sizing me up. I quickened my pace. The sound of my footsteps echoed louder as the street grew narrower. I resisted the urge to look back again, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Not just any footsteps, they were irregular, almost like a shuffle. My heart raced as I realized he was following me. I turned down another street, hoping to lose him. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. I thought I was safe. But then I saw him again, standing under another street lamp, somehow ahead of me now. His posture was the same, but his grin had stretched impossibly wide, like his face wasn't built for such an expression. My hands started to shake. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, and then another. His movements were unnatural, almost like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my sneakers pounding against the pavement. I could hear him behind me, his shuffling steps growing faster. I didn't dare look back. My chest burned as I sprinted down the street, the only thought in my mind being to get home. When I finally reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. After a moment, I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I checked the window, no sign of him. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, shuffling, and then a knock at my door. I ignored the knock and forced myself to sleep. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound and convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination, or maybe someone knocking on the wrong door. The faint shuffling outside continued for a while, slow and uneven, but eventually it stopped. I waited, heart pounding, straining my ears in the silence. Whoever it was, they left. I told myself it was over, that I was safe. But even as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Last week I was in Chicago for work. It wasn't a trip I'd planned or particularly wanted to take, but my boss insisted, and there I was. Alone in a strange city with too much time on my hands. After settling into my hotel, I decided to go for a walk. The streets were alive with the usual city buzz, but I felt oddly disconnected from it all. That's when I saw her. Sarah, my childhood best friend. She was sitting outside a small cafe, a steaming mug in her hands, and her familiar navy blue coat wrapped tightly around her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Sarah and I hadn't seen each other in years, but you don't forget someone like her. She had this unmistakable energy, calm and warm, like she belonged wherever she was. "Sarah?" I called out, unsure if I was imagining things. She looked up, her face lighting up with surprise and recognition. "Oh my God," she said, standing up and pulling me into a hug. Her arms were warm and her smile was exactly as I remembered it. "What are you doing here?" We sat down at her table, and for the next hour it felt like no time had passed. We caught up on everything: work, family, life. She told me about a new job she'd started recently, how she was finally taking that trip to Europe she'd always talked about. I told her about my job, my plans, and how much I missed hanging out with her. She laughed, teased me about still being as stubborn as ever, and told me I should visit her more often. "Here," she said, scribbling her number on a napkin. "Don't be a stranger this time, okay?" I promised I wouldn't. As we said goodbye, she hugged me again and told me to take care of myself. I left the cafe feeling lighter than I had in years, like some part of me I didn't even know was missing had been put back in place. The next day, while scrolling through Facebook during a break at work, my heart stopped. There it was, a post filled with photos of Sarah, her laugh frozen in time, and a caption that made my stomach drop. "Rest in peace, Sarah. You were taken from us too soon. We'll miss you forever." The stranger I knew, with natural pauses added for this. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The post was dated 4 days ago. 4 days. That couldn't be right. I had just seen her last night. We had talked, laughed, hugged. She had written down her number on a napkin. My hands shook as I pulled the napkin out of my pocket. Her handwriting was there, clear as day. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Desperate for answers, I called the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. But it wasn't Sarah. It was her mother. When I asked about Sarah, her voice broke. "Sarah passed away last week," she said softly. "A car accident. She's gone." I hung up, my head spinning. How could she be gone? I had just seen her. I had talked to her. She was real. I even had proof, her handwriting on the napkin. But when I looked down at it again, my stomach turned. The ink was faded now, smudged like it had been written years ago. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it was grief playing tricks on me. Maybe it was Sarah's way of saying goodbye, of reminding me of the bond we had. All I know is that for one night I saw her again. And even though it doesn't make sense, I'm grateful I did. So this happened a couple of years ago, and I still can't explain it. My friends and I were on a weekend road trip, just stopping at random places and exploring small towns. You know, the kind of trip where you post everything on Instagram with captions like small town vibes or cottagecore aesthetic. We ended up in this tiny antique shop that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. It was full of dusty furniture, old clocks, and weird vintage stuff. I was just scrolling TikTok while my friends browsed, but then I saw this necklace in a glass case. It was silver with these cool vine patterns on it, and it looked different, like something you'd see in a moody Pinterest board. It was only $15, so I bought it. When the cashier, this super old lady, handed it to me, she said, "Be careful, that necklace doesn't like to be taken." I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to sound spooky, and we left. At first, it was fine. I put it on, took a couple of selfies, and tagged my friends. But later that night, I started to feel weird. It's hard to explain, but I felt like someone was watching me. Even when we were just chilling at a diner, I kept looking over my shoulder. My friends teased me, saying I was just tired from the drive. That night, we stayed at a cheap Airbnb. While brushing my teeth, I glanced in the mirror and froze. There was this faint shape behind me, like someone standing in the corner of the bathroom. I whipped around, but no one was there. I thought, okay, maybe it's the lighting or something. But my heart was racing. Later, I went to bed and had the creepiest dream. I saw this woman. She was standing in the middle of a dark room, wearing an old dress, like something out of a black and white movie. Her hair was messy, and her face was so pale it almost glowed. She just stared at me. Then she pointed at the necklace around my neck and whispered, "It's mine." I woke up sweating. The necklace was still on, but the pendant felt cold, like ice. I took it off and threw it on the nightstand. The next day, I told my friends, but they said I was probably just stressed out or ate something bad. I almost believed them, until we got in the car and one of them brought up something the shopkeeper said. She told me that necklace was found near a river, my friend said. Apparently, it belonged to a woman who drowned there a long time ago. The shop lady said people who take it always bring it back. I laughed nervously, trying to play it cool, but I was freaking out inside. That night, I had another dream. The same woman was there, but this time she was closer. Her hair was wet, dripping water onto the floor, and she wasn't pointing anymore. She was reaching for me. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. I woke up with this horrible feeling in my chest, like I couldn't breathe. I decided I had to get rid of the necklace. On our way home, we stopped by the antique shop, but it was closed. I left the necklace on the doorstep and hoped that was enough. I thought it was over, but sometimes I still feel like she's following me. I'll be sitting in my room and out of nowhere, I hear the sound of water dripping, even though all the taps are off. And every so often I have that same dream. Her face getting closer, her hand reaching out, and her voice whispering, "It's mine." Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales. Your support helps us bring more content to you. Stay safe out there.